welcome. If you haven't figured it out already, there is pizza outside. There's a restaurant behind me. Who is this their first time at ThoughtWorks today? Alright, well, it's a lot of you. So just give a brief introduction. So ThoughtWorks is a software development consultancy. We were founded on 3 pillars. The first pillar was around forming a sustainable business, so that's making money. The second pillar is around technical excellence, so we have a lofty mission to revolutionize IT. And P3 is to advocate for social and economic justice. And those are things that we actually do pretty much. So this meetup is primarily to share some of our experiences and some of our stories around technical talks. This is actually number 16, and we only started in January, so we've been pretty aggressive. We have some interesting talks coming up. We just had there's a video that just got posted about a previous talk, which was around functional programming. Some talks coming up. We're going to be talking about we're calling it evolving interactions, but that's going to be things like chatbots, IoT, Alexa skills, things like that. We're also going to be talking about evolving QA practices for continuous delivery. I'm going to be talking about that. So today, our talk is on, it's a little mouthful there, but JSDom and Enzyme, giving us new patterns and paradigms of React unit testing. Dan LaFeir is going to be giving it. Say a few things about Dan. So he is he's quite tall. And his mission in life is to move people away from like jQuery soups to loosely coupled, well-tested UI components. So that's it. All right.
Thank you. Yeah, I couldn't have said that more elegantly. Awesome. Yeah. So like to mention, my name is Dan. And I'm going to be talking about that mouthful. And that mouthful is just, I think, the best way to get SEO traffic because it has all the buzzwords in it. But it is actually true. Like we are going to talk about the new patterns and paradigms that I think we get with JSDom and Enzyme. And I want to clarify, I'm talking about JS or React unit testing as it relates to applications running in the browser. So just as a point of clarity. So the first part of this talk, I want to talk about why we unit test. I think all the other points are not really important if you don't think about why we unit test and have a good answer to that question internally. And I want to try to provide a brief answer to this question, not just for us as software developers, but also you might or probably work for a business and they also care about the things that you are producing. So I want to make sure that we're thinking about the benefits of unit testing or why we unit test not only for ourselves but also for a business. So yeah, the first point is living documentation of our code. I think this is the way that I wanted to convey this was show you an example of something so ThoughtWorks is engaged with retail clients. And I've been at a couple of those engagements, and everybody wants a mini cart. Fun fact: everybody wants a mini cart, and all of you probably look at a mini cart component. So let's say you're joining the project. You're like, I know what a mini cart component does roughly, right? It's just this like small section, maybe in the upper right corner. It shows some things that they want to purchase. There's maybe a checkout button. Maybe it takes you to a larger screen. But I think like each client I've been at though has their own needs around a mini cart, and so the tests can act as the documentation for what that mini cart actually does. So this is a modified series of tests that I kind of changed some of the details, but still kind of captures the essence of what we were trying to test. And if you read through these examples, they're like oddly specific. I think specifically the one about like closing after 8 seconds or something, like they wanted that to be a thing. And they were very adamant about this because the people who were doing the user experience were like, these are the things that we want, and they were pretty hard on those. And so what's great though, if we have these unit tests, it not only like demonstrates what that component does, but it also like codifies the acceptance criteria for like as you are trying to build the application, the business is going to say, hey, I need some things like this. If you do some agile methodology around like stories, you have acceptance criteria. You can have this kind of documented and actually in your unit test. Yeah, and I think the other thing that's interesting about like the living documentation is that the phenomenon that we all have probably had at one point or another is that you've looked at some code that you've written and said like, what does this do? And so, and I think that we need to be able to like easily do that, especially when something like that, like a mini card, can get quite complex. And so I go to another example that was actually part of the same project, and we had a component called the refreshable content. And I think that's like way less clear. Like I don't think any of you maybe are like, nah, I think I know what that is. It's just, it's refreshable. What does that mean? And so I'm not actually going to show you the test for this, but if you were to join my team or you were to join the project, the first place I would direct you to is the unit test for this component, because it would tell you exactly where, exactly what the component was going to do. Just start the timer too. Cool. So another reason that I would argue you want to unit test, or why would you unit test, is the confidence as we change our code. And as we scale, confidence as we're changing our code as we're scaling. And I think the way that I wanted to convey this was rock climbing. I think this is actually quite a popular sport in the software development community, or at least that's what I've seen. And lead climbing is one of the things that you can do in rock climbing, where as you are climbing up the wall, you're kind of putting these hooks in place to kind of prevent yourself from a catastrophic fall, lest you get tired or make a mistake. And I think that I really like this analogy because for a couple reasons, but one, that you're like spending a little bit of extra effort as you're going up the wall to prevent like yourself from like a dangerous situation given some sort of fatigue or just like human error. But like tying this back to code, I think the questions that I wanted to ask were like, how will you know that your code works in the future? Are you always going to be working on it? And again, that phenomenon of like, what was I doing when I was here and working on this code? And I think we need to make sure we're putting some checks, and not only for ourselves, but also as other people are working on the same code that we've worked on. And likewise, thinking about the business, right? Like what happens when your code breaks? What happens when if you don't want it to take a giant fall and bringing that back to the rock climbing, you don't want to take down the site, like that could cost you millions of dollars. Rather, we want to have these things along the way, so we have just a short fall instead of a long one. So these are the 2 points that I wanted to make. I'm sorry, these are not the 2 points I want to make. I'm ahead on my slides. These are the 2 questions that or things that I wanted to bring up to convey, or I want you to ask yourself to say like that you have good, like, by asking yourself these questions or saying if you can do these things to your code, you do have good unit coverage, unit test coverage. So stop right now what you're doing and just hand it over. Do you feel confident enough to do that? If you don't, maybe you need some more. Maybe you need unit tests, or maybe you need some better unit tests. And then make a change and try to push it straight to production. So I don't know how comfortable you feel doing that. But as going from different enterprises and seeing large organizations with large code bases, sometimes it's actually quite terrifying, which is a weird phenomenon. So I think, like, again, these were the 2 points that I wanted to bring up, what I was trying to say earlier, of why we unit test. But I think this is definitely not an exhaustive list. You can say, it's not an exhaustive list. These are the more salient, less debatable points, I would argue. Funny enough. But like you can also get things from like, you can get benefits from like TDD, and also it's fair to say that like why we unit test and the benefits of testing is not really fully actualized unless we have a comprehensive test strategy. The other thing that I want to add too is it's necessary for large code bases. It's absolutely necessary. Like if you're not unit testing in a large code base, like when you change something, you might fall off the rock wall, and that's not good. Like being in an enterprise and seeing people complex, like being in an enterprise with large code bases, like the more code you're adding, the more complexity you're adding, the more sometimes fear you're adding to when they say, hey, some business requirements have changed, or we want to change the front page, and they believe that like the fall special is coming out, and like that needs to get there. Otherwise, they're not going to sell stuff to people. So yeah, that's a little bit about why we test, and I want to just try to provide like some argument for that, because I think we need to be able to answer that question both internally, like while we're writing tests, like why are we actually doing this? I think the two tools though that really enable the second really part of this talk and the main part of this talk is JSDom and Enzyme, and I want to spend just a minute trying to talk through these tools a little bit, because I think that they really enable the conversation I'm going to try to have today, in the future slides. So JSDom, for those who are not familiar, I was going to write my own descriptions of what like these tools were, but like luckily enough, these sites are very good at explaining what they do, and so I just kind of stole this from JSDom. It is a pure JavaScript implementation of many web standards, notably the what a wig, or at least that's what I've said, DOM and HTML standards for Node.js. And I think that's like a mouthful, but it is it's like this implementation that I think feels very familiar to these type of tools. And while I'm talking about unit testing and kind of JSDom, I don't want to necessarily like duke out the merits of like this versus like those other tools, because I think like these all have a time and a place. I think there's some very key differences between these tools and JSDom that I want to point out. And I think that like there's some characteristics of these tools that I think we see are maybe not necessarily not existing in JSDom, and also for unit testing. I mean, maybe Karma you can write unit tests for or with, but you don't necessarily usually leverage these tools when you're writing unit tests. Great. So I want to talk about the advantages of JSDom. The first point being avoiding race conditions by being in process. So what does that mean? That means that we can have deterministic tests and avoid false positives, which helps us keep our bill of green. Like that has been probably my favorite feature of JSDom when trying to write tests or thinking about like unit testing as it relates to JavaScript, because like those other frameworks, and very often you've probably seen if you have something like Phantom.js tests, or you have some tests running in a real browser, oh no, we didn't wait long enough because the promise needed to resolve because some downstream latency is actually, or some downstream network call is taking too long, and something's not rendering properly. And so this has been a huge advantage, or this gives us a huge advantage of like having some determinism in our tests. Sort of, and I'll get to we still have promises, but our tests are executing, or the things that we're interacting with in DOM are in process. The other thing, lightweight. So I think this is important, especially kind of put up against those other tools that are a little bit more notably slower. And this is an important point as we scale up our code bases. So as we have more tests, it's going to get slower. I mean, even the JavaScript tests are going to get slower. But for those of you who have worked on large JavaScript code bases, man, it's really cool that those tests can sometimes run in like 3 seconds because of parallelism and the powerful test runners that we have out there. And I think like if you've ever worked in like a Java environment where you have like this fast feedback cycle writing unit tests, I think we can start getting getting that flavor if we're writing unit tests. I mean, if you're writing JavaScript unit tests, you can kind of feel that same. You want them to be fast. You don't want them to be like the karma, spin up 4 minutes, wait, and then get some feedback and say, oh no, we actually broke something. And the other thing is that it's implemented in JavaScript, which is great because if something goes wrong, then you know what's going wrong, or you can look up what's going wrong, and you can debug it. Like you have some instincts about how JavaScript works. It is an open source tool, so you can look through the source code, and you can also contribute, which is great. And cheers to the people who have. So these are some of the advantages that I wanted to kind of call out. I think oftentimes JSDom doesn't necessarily get the recognition maybe that it deserves, or the recognition in general. It is sometimes just that thing in the setup file that people instantiate the JSDom and they kind of make their test setup script and they just kind of move on. They don't actually know like what this is actually doing. But I think that this is like a very this is a core piece of like JavaScript unit testing, or at least JavaScript unit testing as it relates to React and some of these tools that we need to talk about. And great, and the other one being Enzyme. So like I said before, they're really good at writing these things, and it's great. I think this one's a little bit more wordy though, about like being able to traverse and assert, and manipulate, and I think like what that means for me, or the things that I kind of wanted to say about that is that it really just gives me a cleaner interface for interacting with React components. I don't know if you've ever console logged a React component. That thing is huge, and there's a lot of things, there's a lot of structural things that like allow it to be what it is. And I think I don't personally want to traverse those components in my tests, nor do I want to write a library to simulate the DOM interactions that we get by mounting those things in JSDom, and write a library to mount them in JSDom and interact with them. Enzyme does this really well, and I think as they've evolved, it's gotten better. It's got better and better. But I think like Enzyme also has like allowed me personally to think about our components being actually rendered in the DOM, and I think that this talk actually evolved from working with React Native when it was pretty young and pretty new, where you don't have a DOM, and these tools weren't necessarily fitted to work with React Native. Like it was like 14 or something. It was just like hot and fresh, and everybody was excited about it. But it allowed me to think about these things being rendered, and these things being rendered, and when moving back to the browser, rendered in a DOM. And I think that's ultimately at the end of the day, I would argue what we care about, like what the user sees and what the user interacts with. And I thought that was like really powerful. So these two tools are going to kind of drive, or they're like the underpinning of the next couple slides. And I'm not going to go through the advantages of this like I did with JSDom, because I think a lot of people who are using React are a little bit more familiar with what Enzyme does and the different capabilities that it has. You're probably familiar firsthand with like using the different functions and traversing those React components. Cool. So let's look at some tests. I mean, giving this talk in the past, everybody's like, where's the code? So here we are. Not really though, because I watched this. No, I think, like I said, like thinking about these things when we're writing our unit tests, thinking about them as they're rendered in the DOM, I wanted to provide some kind of visual representation about what we're going to be talking about. We're going to walk through some unit tests, but these unit tests will be testing what this is, the login app, right? This is like my version of to-do MVC. And so the interactions of this app will be click the login button, it shows you the form, fill out the form, click the submit button, makes a network request, and then boom, we see our account details. Very simple. And so yeah, we're going to look at some tests that are testing this app. But I want this picture to be in your head while we're thinking about the tests. So let's step through the test. So this is a test. Read my small screen. Testing that it adds error messages to an empty form. Something that let's say the business who's producing this app, that you said, why are you producing this app? And they're like, no, just do it. said we really want error messages when they don't submit correct information or when it's blank. I think this test is, I'm writing this test because the way that I've written it, because I feel like I've seen this a lot, and some characteristics of this test that I've seen a lot. Getting the instance of the object like this, not necessarily you have to do it like that, you could definitely do it differently. Calling a function that is on the instance because we need to simulate the onLogin or the onSubmit, the onLogin to show us that form and the onSubmit to submit the form. And I think what's interesting about this is that this violates like a rule of encapsulation, like something that you'd never do in your Java unit tests or your other unit tests from other things. But we see it. We see like those underscore functions that are like private functions, but not really. We don't treat them the same way that we do when we're writing unit tests. And then we'll do some expectation on maybe the state of the object. I kind of just gave it this name, this variable name errors, I think like this test is something that I've seen kind of similarly as I've seen a lot of different unit tests written for React. But I mean, it does in fact check that like validation is working. Like if the component that is login form is submitted with no errors, yeah, this is probably going to work, like the way that we set it up. And I think hopefully you can visualize maybe the implementation that satisfies this. And I want to ask real quick, how many people have seen tests like this before? No? Oh, wow. Okay. Like accessing the instance of the object, just trying to call like a private member function, and then asserting on some function return values. I've seen it quite often, or different various forms of this. And I think that we can write them just a little bit differently. And this is, drum roll, this is the exciting part. So we're going to do the exact same test, but we're going to write it ever so slightly differently. And I think what we're going to do is test like the interactions that the user will have. So we mount the component. We're not necessarily getting the instance. We get the mounted wrapper. We do what the user is actually going to do. Like they're going to click on a button with their mouse, and it's going to simulate a DOM event called click. And that click button is going to have some action. And what's great is like this is all synchronous operations. Like you see this like a render, or if a render is triggered, that's great. It's going to come like all of that's going to happen. The call stack's going to resolve, and boom, we're going to go to the next line, and your component's going to be rendered into the new state. Yeah, so this is exactly what the user is doing. Like I think we don't actually care that some value errors was set on the component. We just care that the user sees these two error messages, because for some reason this is like what the business said, hey, like we need to show them some errors if they fill it out incorrectly. And so I think like I do instance.text. You could more specifically target a better component. But I am trying to look at what the user actually sees on the screen, because if I change the way that errors is handled under the hood, if I don't necessarily use the onLogin function for this to happen, if I don't don't use the onSubmit function, like some of those things could definitely change. But at the end of the day, I want to be able to click on the form when there's no values and see some errors, and that's it. Now I think, again, this is like a simplified example, and I'm trying to make this, hopefully that the point of like, there's a very subtle difference here, yeah, I'll get your question at the end. Yeah, so some characteristics of these tests, that we're testing the things that are less likely to change. So the onLogin function, the way in which we model state could be different. We're testing the interactions and behaviors over the functions, so we're not violating that rule of encapsulation when we're writing, when we're defining these classes, whatever that means nowadays in JavaScript. I mean that we do have classes, but it's not like the same classes that we see in like something like Java. Yeah, and this necessitates fewer tests. So I think ultimately that's what we care about. But you could write a couple different tests of validation to make sure that you have the coverage that you need to make sure that your validations are working, or that your unit test will break when something changes. So I want to talk about a different example. Yes.
In the other example, what was instance? Maybe I'll find variable.
What was instance in the other example?
I think it just should be right.
Oh, my apologies. Oh, snap. Oh, man. That is supposed to be wrapper. My apologies. Yeah, so that is the wrapper. I thought that I got it all. Damn. Nice catch. Shouldn't have taken your question. Cool. Yeah, if you notice a typo, this is clearly for demonstration. This doesn't necessarily compile.
It hasn't gone through unit tests.
Yeah, exactly. I've written. I wanted to make sure that this code was as clear as possible, or in conveying this message, which doesn't necessarily mean that it's the original code that I wanted to write for this simple stupid app that literally logs in. And so, yeah, we'll even see more of that stuff here. And I'm pretty sure, this one also, I think this one compiles. But it exudes the exact same properties. So this setup is a little bit more convoluted, and you don't necessarily have to use a spy in this example. Oh, sorry. You don't necessarily have to use a spy in this example. You could definitely use a stub. But to make this point, I wanted to use a spy, because I've seen people use a spy like this, and I don't necessarily think it's overly valuable. They get the instance of the object again, defining some credentials object just for ease of use. And then they click we call the function kind of similarly to the last test. They set state on the instance, because that's how I can get the state of that React component to a place that I want it to be. And then I can call the onSubmit function, and then all of a sudden assert that stub was in fact called, and that the redirect, the state of the object, that's maybe how we're redirecting to the login page, is set to true or set to some value. Set to true. You could set the state of the object to something to tell it to redirect somewhere else. And I've seen tests like this, but I'm like, why are you asserting on the spy? What value does that? And a lot of people feel comfortable because they can say well, I know those functions need to be called, and if those functions are not called, this test will break. And they can change some code, they can see it break, and they feel great. They wrote some unit tests, and that's I think a point that I keep coming back to when I talk to you about this idea that just writing them just slightly differently is that the tests that you're writing that write like this can be perfectly fine unit tests, in the sense that they will make sure that if you change the way that your code works, they could definitely fail. They could definitely fail because they care about the implementation. If those validators weren't necessarily working, it would break. Yeah, I think that's. This is how I would write this one. A little bit more setup, and I think that the setup is interesting for a couple reasons. One, this goes into the power that I think Enzyme gives us. You can write a wrapper function like fill in field, which is I've done this many times where you say fill in field is the function. It's defined either in some helpers that are imported or maybe at the top of the class. And it looks for an element, simulates, and does all of the kind of things that you need to do, the DOM events that will actually happen. But people can read the test and they can say, I know what that's doing. It's filling in the field, and that's great. And this is super great for other people in the organization, especially if you have QAs, or you have people that are looking at your tests and want to understand your test coverage. Because when they look at fill in field, they get it. They're I know what that means. That it just fills in the field. I could have wrote a wrapper around, again, the button click thing, but like I said, this test I wanted to make sure would fit it all on one page. And so So yeah, so I think like that, the other thing is we can also use a stub to resolve. Ideally, I'd love for that stub to actually have like with args. I try not to use really any libraries outside of React, JSDom, and Enzyme, but Synon just seems to find a way. Yeah, so Synon, if you're not familiar, is a stubbing tool. Very popular at yeah, so, and then the other thing is that, result, I think, is just a convenient function that will return a promise that is result. So again, we're testing the interactions that the user is going to have, kind of similarly like through those arrows. They are going to fill in these fields. They're going to click that login button to show you the view. They're going to fill in the fields, and then they're going to click the submit button, which will then in turn make a network request, which we stubbed out above. And I didn't call this out earlier, but the imported API function, I'm hoping that as an audience you can imagine that is an object that is imported both into the test as well as into the component itself. And that our API is kind of behind that. So we make a network call, and that ultimately just returns a promise. So in some method, we define a call to this thing, and then we have a .then and a .catch. And then we expect, and I use redirect because it's familiar with React Router. You could also write your own redirect component that would redirect you somewhere else. But I also kind of really like React Router's idea to switch to use something like redirect, because now the state of that component renders this thing that is now redirecting. And it feels a little weird, but it also works really, really well when we talk about tests like this. I'm not spying on a function that's going to be called that's going to redirect me somewhere else. I'm actually just I'm just making assertions on that render function or the output of that render function. I'm just going to call this one out because I know someone will, or either now or after. Is that what about asynchronous things, Dan? Right? How does that expectation actually work? And I think you technically need to put something like an eventually there. But I didn't want to again choose the some either Jest or Mocha or the different test runners. There are tricks, I think, associated with writing tests like this that you just have to use different things that are tricky in writing asynchronous tests. Something like eventually, or other there's other tricks and tools, but eventually I think it's pretty powerful to do that. So I think, hopefully you can see the differences between those two tests and say, I see what you're talking about the user interactions or the things that we maybe care about as a visual representation. As these things are rendered into the DOM, these are the things that the user will see and interact with, which I think is pretty powerful. We always got to talk about the downside about things, because we don't necessarily want to. I'm not saying that this is all rainbows. There are some tricks, there are some things associated with this that are definitely worth calling out. And for those who TDD, I think this pattern has been very tricky to write that first test, the first or second test, because the things that you are testing, I think, breaks out of the conventional unit test model, which is to say that if you had something like Redux under the hood, you would still write similar tests to that. You would still simulate those events, but Redux might be playing a part in that. And I think some of that, the wiring of your component will you'll just have to write that, and it won't necessarily be completely test driven, which feels uncomfortable to some people. Whereas calling the functions or writing the functions and then saying, okay, cool, now I need to define this function feels a little bit more natural. The errors are not immediately obvious, so I think those tests, if you're not careful, can get pretty big, or not pretty big, but pretty they cover a lot of stuff, and there could be a lot of things that are baked into that validation that you want to make sure you cover. And it's where it broke in the validation is maybe not necessarily immediately obvious, but I think that these tests I've still found that within a reasonable amount of time I can triangulate where the error is, and I'm okay taking that hit. And I think that you must understand the tooling and JavaScript to do these tests, because oftentimes people don't feel comfortable writing these tests because it's hard to visualize what is happening under the hood with JSDom and simulating to all of a sudden make your React component into this state that says these error messages or this ultimately your account details or some redirect. And I think that there's a little bit more of a gap there that's some people will have a hard time bridging just because they don't necessarily understand what JSDom is even doing. Right? That's just like something set up in their project a long time ago. They probably don't. Some people on the team don't even know that that's even a part of it. So yeah, I think that's really the whole point that I want to make, is that these tests, you can write them very so slightly differently and get like this value out of them that I think is pretty novel and pretty interesting. But fundamentally, again, like to kind of cover what we talked about, I want to be able to add. I would love for you to say like, why do you unit test, or be able to ask them, why do you unit test? And the people that I work with on teams, like I want to ask them like, why are you writing this test? Are you just writing this test because you think you need to write it, or because that's how you know to make sure that code will break, or that unit test will break if something changes? What do you do? Why are you doing this? And then I think hopefully I conveyed some of the power, at least of the tools like JSDom and Enzyme. Yeah, I mean, like I think JSDom is definitely something people are not talking about enough, or at least on teams that I've worked at with that are doing React. They're talking about React, they're talking about Enzyme. They're not saying the word JSDom, which is like kind of concerning to me. And then examining the value that we extract from JavaScript tests. I think. Again, like I want to be able to go back to those original questions about like changing, or the confidence that we have of changing our code, of the documentation. I mean, even the documentation is better when you have this, because it's the user's interactions with the code. It's not these function calls that like maybe you're semantic when you write your function names, but like maybe you're not, and like those things could definitely vary from developer to developer. So yeah, I think we should be interrogating and thinking about why are we writing tests and what value are we getting out of them. And that's it. Pretty simple. Hopefully. That's a big thing. Yeah, so I can take some questions. There definitely. JavaScript is a very opinionated community. So I was like preparing myself for this. So yeah.
First of all, thanks for the talk. I very much agree with this suggestion. Right.
Nice.
Yes, that was
Nice.
I
will pay you later. Thank you. I will pay you later.
I didn't understand your point about why this is harder to achieve.
Yeah, I think these examples are a little, again, they're very simplified, I think, to try to point out some of the points that, to make some points, but I think if you use something like Redux or other tooling with React, it doesn't feel natural to write like one of those tests and then have to like connect your components to some reducers and then some action creators.
You're saying because the test setup is more complicated?
No, because even like so sometimes you don't necessarily need to do anything with Redux as it relates. I mean, you do need to provide like the provider, and I would argue like you should really render it in like a real Redux store, the Redux store that you're doing or that you're using. But to render a component in a with a Redux store, for the first time that you're writing the component, you need to hook it all up to Redux. And people have kind of said like, well, wait, how do I TDD the action creator? How do I TDD the reducer that I'm now making for this connection to Redux? Very often, I've given this talk to a community of React developers who, like, it's almost like React and Redux are just like they just say them in the same sentence or the same breath. So that's where it's been painful. I wouldn't say you can't do it, that's for sure.
Well, what I'm thinking is that if you write a test like you're proposing, then the test actually forces you to connect it to a Redux store, whereas if you're testing that the method of this component do what they're supposed to do, you can't just forget to connect it to the store at all, and the test still pass. So I'm thinking that's actually like better or
yeah,
proper to use.
I think like TDD, I've seen like many forms of it, I think, I know that like the reason I bring that up is because people have complained about it, but like I would also argue, yeah, sure, like it does force you to do all those things, but some people feel like they need to test drive out all of those things, which maybe you don't.
In like separate unit tests.
Yeah, separate unit tests. Yeah, sorry, that's where I'm coming from. Some people have argued that they need to do that. I'm like, maybe. Maybe. Yes.
So how would you recommend actually encouraging better code quality with this style? Because it's so focused on the DOM and the actual user's perspective that you can have, like totals with data craziness and you can know.
I think, let me make sure I understand your question, but how do you make sure that you have the correct test coverage? Is that
How does this style of coding improve actual readability or like the actual code itself? Because it seems more functional than the actual code itself that you're testing. Because it's all based on the visual of the DOM.
I think I like to make the argument about like visualization of the DOM but like something like redirect is not necessarily the case. Like it's ultimately the output of the render function, which I think the visualization of DOM is really just like a more digestible concept or way to present this, but the like promoting of code coverage or making sure that like this is like providing you like increasing the quality of your code. I think like the quality of your code is going to be, as long as you have the unit test coverage, however you have it, like, or however you cover that, like you're going to make sure that your app is still working when you change it. But like I think with this, like you have less tests to cover the same amount of things. The unit tests, again, to go back to those things earlier, like the documentation I think is just a little bit more richer, right? Like I think this is not like exponentially better. Like this, I would say that this is like going to like change the way that you do. It isn't going to like dramatically improve your stuff. I think it's going to marginally improve your stuff, and I think those margins are going to be seen greater at scale because instead of writing upwards of like 10,000 tests, you're going to only be writing like 8. And that's less stuff to maintain, that's less stuff to worry about. So I guess it's really maybe the quality or the benefits really come at scale when we talk about something like quality or maintainability. Is that what you're getting at? Oh, sorry, I'm sorry to pin that down.
I think part of it is like, as you talk about it in the context of TDD, it's red, green, and then refactor, right? It's not, everything's beautiful at green.
Right.
I agree that it's more of a functional type test in the sense that which I think we did on purpose because we want to get away from the implementation. But when you do the downside, I think I can sort of agree that this is not going to drive like maybe the most beautiful code in the back, maybe where I've got, but at least it's covered, right?
Right.
And at least you know it's going to break if you change it. However, I think doing the lower level testing is actually going to make it more brittle if you do the factorings.
Sure.
Same with like I guess when you're testing regular server apps.
So maybe like a combination?
Yeah, and now I get it. What you said totally hit. I think like also the reason why in the first example I say like this is perfectly fine, like it does actually unit test your stuff. Like this is I wouldn't say like all your unit tests should look like this. I think like there's a lot of unit tests that could look like this, but like usually this conversation sometimes goes into Redux. And people are like, so you're saying like I don't test the complex reducer that does this really complex function? And I'm like, well, first of all, why are you doing that? But that's okay. No, write a unit test that does test that complex code. If you have, any like complex business logic, like give it a little love. But maybe the other tests that are, I think this is really to add another tool to your toolbox, not necessarily like you should do this for all your tests.
You're trying to avoid this question, but with this kind of functional style of testing the components, especially if you have like components with other components, I wonder, can it actually reduce the reliance on like a Selenium test? Will this replace Selenium?
Yeah, that's a dangerous waters, actually. So I have given this talk a couple times. Actually, in previous iterations of this talk, I talked about the whole test pyramid and thinking about your test strategy holistically. Like, I think what's cool is that we see, like, you could say, like, Dan, like, maybe that login app, those tests are actually testing, like, more than I'd want to test of, like, a component. And I would say, yeah. And you can write what I've called in some projects subcutaneous functional tests. Test flows of your interactions that your users are doing, because those other tests that run in something like Chromium or Selenium or something like that are going to be slower. And so I think that it's a tricky conversation to have, but I think like you can get some more of that coverage that we get at full browser tests at a lower level. And maybe that necessitates fewer functional tests, which if we have all developers in the room, we may all agree on. Maybe not. We still need functional tests. They still have a place. I think they're absolutely, they definitely provide value. But I think that what you're getting at is absolutely right. Like, we could extend this, and you have to be careful about what you are testing. What is the scope of those things? But man, those tools are pretty powerful, and they let you test more.
To that point, why do you call these unit tests?
Yeah, because that's familiar to people. I think we call them unit tests, but I think unit tests you could redefine. I think given this talk to a couple people, it really sounds like we're redefining what the unit under test is. Especially, I think it's easier to see if we have something like Redux attached to this, because we're not necessarily testing that Redux works or how Redux is working. We're defining that the unit under test as a component, and I think Redux is maybe the easiest example, but a unit under test would not necessarily just be the component, but it would be the component, its action creators and its reducers, and all of those like communications that it has with Redux. That is the unit under test, and if something breaks within that unit, we will have to look in all of those different places, but in fact, this is a little bit bigger. I think the surface area is just a little bit bigger. I'm going to go back. We'll go back to that.
Yeah, so I think you're getting at there are more tests than this in your imagined test scenario. What are the rest? Like, where else? What levels do you test?
Talking about like a test pyramid and like other forms of coverage.
Sure. I mean, this doesn't seem like the only way you want to test. So
Yeah, absolutely.
how else do you imagine tests being written?
Yeah, I think you need contract tests. You were making some calls to some network, probably maybe a third-party API, maybe not, maybe your own API. But you have a lot of people working on this thing, so you want to write contract tests, because if the contracts between your API or some other API breaks, you want to know that they break there. I think contract tests are super valuable. I think functional tests, like writing and actually spinning these things up in a browser, because JSDom is only one implementation of the DOM spec. Every browser has their own opinion on that. I think we've seen some cohesion as we move forward, and way to go Microsoft for getting on the bandwagon. I think, like things like browser stack, we can actually see and confirm that these things actually render and work. And especially before React 16 came out, with like the ability to like handle errors or like error boundaries. What if your app didn't run in like one of the browsers that you need to support? So we need to check those things. I think it definitely depends on your application. I hate to give like an answer that's like, it depends. But like, I think it is, what are the requirements for your application? And I think there's a lot of things that you can get with this unit testing, but like, you can't unit test your contracts, or at least I don't want to, because I don't want to be dependent on a downstream system for all of my unit tests, because then my unit tests might break occasionally because those systems go down or they're flaky or something like that. I think you definitely need those things as it relates to like a JavaScript or application browser. Michael, you had something else?
I would challenge you to think of these as like integration tests, and use a stricter definition of unit tests to inform the design of your components so that they are easy to test in unit tests.
So, are you suggesting that like the style in which we write these tests are in fact completely classified as integration tests?
I'd say the list of downsides that you listed, saying why this style of testing is harder, should inform your design.
Okay.
You could design your components better so you didn't need the style of test, or if you did strictly need the style of test, it would only be an integration.
So maybe the claim is that you don't necessarily need something like a. Are you saying that maybe we don't need unit tests?
No, I'm saying you do need a unit test. These aren't it.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I think the like.
I'm going to talk in more detail.
Yeah, let's talk about it later because that sounds like a really deep topic that we can't necessarily address in the crowd.
This is a common for that. We wrote very similar tests in past projects that I was on, and we didn't call them unit tests. We still wrote them the same way, and then we called them integration tests, and then we called the browser-based tests browser tests. But that's just the terminology.
Yeah, we've also called this behavioral component tests, which like again like introducing like yet another term for everybody to learn. Just like I don't know, the unit test was easier to relate this to.
Because arguably the surface here, if you have encapsulation of components,
Yeah.
it's very UI driven, and it's going up, and the surface here is growing, it's not good at it. You're still testing it, that's not.
Absolutely, and
You're clicking on things and kind of sliding.
yeah, and I think though I would also though encourage the similar tests to something like that text input field, right? Like that text input field could be its own component that we import into this login component. We're not necessarily testing or want to test that the text input field is working, or we can because this is maybe it's an integration test. But we write this test, a similar test to test the text input field that says. The DOM event still needs to manipulate the text input field. That's maybe what you were getting at, right? Like that's maybe why this feels like a more of like an integration test. Yeah, because if the logging component is in fact just organizing these components, why does it have a unit test? It's just this like presentational thing. I'll know if it's broken. Like these things won't even be here, or we won't be able to use the component because some functional test might break. But in fact, the interesting stuff to test around validation might be even smaller at that input field, or that component that we're going to call the input field.
In your way, maybe then everybody has a different definition of what is an atomic unit of test.
Yeah, and that's something. Just to repeat that, or as I've seen this play out, like where's the limitation, or where do you draw the line around what you're testing? And again, I think that even goes back to the integration point. Like, where's the line around this? I think that's why I want to bring up that first point again. Like, why do we unit test? What are we doing? Like, what are the value that we're getting out of these tests? Maybe they're not unit tests. Maybe they're behavioral component tests. And I think you have to have a conversation with the person you're pairing with, or the person on your team about like, what do you want to define that as? I just want to show you that you can do it. That's about it.
No, it's not. Because I can imagine this thing all break down. Let's say you click on a file and something happens for 8 seconds, and at the end, there's the result.
Yeah.
So then, there's an animation, right? Whatever the case may be. You can't stop it out. You have to. That's the behavior of the component. So,
Well,
built in, like you said, like spaghetti. When something happens, so then request is inherently behavior, right?
Yeah.
Even though it looks exactly like that. You click on something, and then you expect something.
Well, an interesting question that comes up with looking at those tests is like, how did you test like animations or time? It's like JSDom. It's all like you have the power. You have the power to control the clock and the ticks and all that stuff. And I think that there's a couple. I think we're putting our faith in these tools that they're going to work. But I think it's maybe well placed. You have a question?
Yeah, I just wanted to get back maybe to Enzyme and talk, or just have you like give a couple points about maybe things you wish you knew before you started working with it, like growing pains that you had with it, or like things that it solved that you didn't expect it to solve.
Yeah, I think so. The question was like, what has been my experience with Enzyme and where have the pain points been? And I think so. I've seen Enzyme when it actually originally came out up until now, and it's definitely grown a lot. I think the current pain points that I have are I really like that they added that you can now search like the redirect component with a string. but originally or in older versions you had to actually import the component. Whether I was like, if my test was quite large, like I didn't want to import all of those components that I wanted to search for. I just wanted to search via the string. I think I wish Enzyme actually provided that just a little bit more like cleaner interface for something like some basic things like filling in a text field or clicking a button that felt more semantic. Maybe you could write that library and I will import it into my project because we just import stuff from the internet, right? That I think that is really what I want the most out of it. I want out of it. I think also, thank goodness for the people who are putting together like natures and expectation libraries or assertion libraries that are like better to like say like this couldn't simulate on this node not found. It's like, oh, like what does that mean? Or like that test output is not very great. However, like there's been I think improvements there. I wish that the error messages around when it fails or cannot find something, I think that's a little bit more, I wish I could be a little bit more verbose. Or not necessarily verbose, but like just say something that's more meaningful to me. Yeah, I think those are probably my biggest things with Enzyme. Kudos to Airbnb. I really appreciate that they're like pushing things out to the community. That's great. Man, we really lean heavily on OSS, don't we? So yeah, hashtag
So a minor question, but do you always try to go for testing the render output based on user events, or do you find it's useful in some cases to actually check or test the props or state that is set?
So the question was like, is there a time to test the props or the state? Like, do you always test the rendered output of the component? And my answer to that is almost always just the rendered output. If for some reason you need to test that, then sure. But I think yeah, I mean, obviously, like if there's something that you feel like cannot be covered by these things, I think so. So my instinct is to try to test something like this, and if I can't, then I will think about a different way to test it. A different way to ensure that if I change code and I get like I want those fundamentally those two things and some more, but like those two things about like confidence and documentation, and for this one maybe confidence. So yeah, I mean, I might write a test that is asserting on the state or the props, but probably not, because that stuff is not really what I care about. I ultimately usually care about what the rendered output of that component is. And rendered output, I think, again, is easy to map to something that is visual, but in fact, rendered output could be something different, like the redirect component. Like that is just a way of saying, like, this component's going to redirect this, or some other component of rendering. And maybe it's not rendering, but like that's the final output. And I think like it's a little bit more of a functional paradigm. Like I think like, hey, I'm going to do some things, or I'm going to put in some input and I'm going to just check the output, but the output being just like rendered code. Sure. Yeah. Time. Okay. Cool. Thank you for the questions. This has been great. That was really
Thanks, Dan. Just one thing, there is a board outside to give us feedback, give us suggestions for new talks, and yeah, any positive or negative feedback. The next talk will be mine, which was the evolving QA practices for continuous delivery, and I think that's in about 2 weeks' time. Hope to see you there.
Question. Sorry. You said that